One of the many ways that Mobius Digital's Outer Wilds is unprecedented is its genre. It could be referred to as an adventure game, which is already a very broad genre label, applied to everything from The Legend of Zelda to Monkey Island. It certainly has much in common with these games, but it also shares a great deal of its DNA with space sims like Elite Dangerous and narrative walking simulators like Gone Home. The result is something unique. The game is set in a tiny star system around a dying sun. You are a member of a primitive-looking, though spacefaring species called Harthians. As the latest Harthian astronaut, it's up to you what you do. The solar system is yours to explore as you see fit, but you'll only have 22 minutes in which to do it. After that, the sun explodes, you and everyone else in the system dies, and then you wake up again at the beginning of the 22-minute loop. Why this is happening to you becomes one of the central mysteries that you can solve while playing the game. You see, this solar system was once inhabited by an ancient, long-dead race of aliens called the Nomai, and much of the gameplay centres around decoding their messages and working out what they knew and what they were doing. This 22-minute loop is really essential to how this all plays out, as things will change in the solar system over its course in a predictable fashion, allowing you to do, well, all sorts of things. The specifics of what you can do will almost certainly be spoilers. The things I want to say about this game in fact will require me to spoil it. If you haven't played it, I would definitely recommend it. You can pick it up on Epic Games Store for £10, or your regional equivalent, if you use one of their coupons. It's definitely worth it, it's a really special game, and it benefits massively from being played blind. But it has a problem, and a serious one at that. You see, one of the main mysteries the game centres around is that of the quantum moon. This is a moon that can be spotted orbiting each of the solar system's various planets, seemingly jumping between each when you aren't looking. It is a quantum object, meaning that its position is uncertain until it is observed. The act of observation somehow resolves the uncertainty of its position, and it appears in one place until the observer looks away again. In real life, objects with this property, or rather the effects of such objects, have only been observed on the sub-microscopic scale. The developers are imagining blowing the effects up to objects the size of an entire moon. Now, in the game's backstory, the ancient alien race, the Nomai, treated journeying to the quantum moon as a sort of sacred pilgrimage. It was thought to help them on their quest to understand the mysteries of the universe. You can unravel exactly how they managed this by exploring and learning the various rules that govern its behaviour, as well as utilising some tools that the Nomai left, like a quantum moon tracker. The rules you eventually learn are 1. That observing a photograph of a quantum object is as good as observing the object itself when it comes to resolving its position. This means that if you need a quantum object to remain in one location while you look in another direction, it will, provided you are holding a photograph of the object. 2. If you're standing on a quantum object and you stop observing it, or the surroundings that you would be observing when standing on it, then the object can move to another position, but you will come with it. The way you can provoke this effect in game is by removing all light sources while standing on the quantum object. 3. All vessels that arrive on the quantum moon do so at its south pole. And 4. When you're on the moon, you will find a shrine built by the Nomai. In order for the moon to move to its mysterious 6th location, which is not around any of the planets in the solar system, this shrine must be at the moon's north pole. Right, that's all the rules. What's cool about the quantum moon demonstrates what's cool about the Outer Wilds in general. You learn a set of rules that would be impossible to learn in one 22-minute time loop, either because they require you to go to opposite ends of the system, or they require certain time-sensitive conditions to be met, and you bring them forward to subsequent loops and apply them to progress. To get to the quantum moon and its 6th location, you need to apply all these rules. At no point do you ever unlock any new skills or abilities, so all of your forward momentum is solely created by your new knowledge as a player. In a sense, this game is, like many games, a power fantasy, except the power you get by playing this is not power for your character in-game, it's knowledge of events past and future, which you learn, and which ends up translating to power for your character anyway. In the end though, this extra knowledge made available by the time loop is not simply a blessing. Your eventual understanding of the inevitability of the universe's end and rebirth fills you with a sense of awe, to be sure, but there is undeniably something bittersweet about it too. Your power has not gotten you something unambiguously good. This is, of course, neat as hell. With the quantum moon, however, there's a problem. You're taught the first rule, that observing a photograph of a quantum object is as good as observing the real object, in a series of puzzles that require you to look away from some quantum object while using a photograph to keep it in place. You're meant to apply this rule to land on the quantum moon. You need a photograph of it up in order to land on it. Except, when doing this, you aren't applying this rule. You are applying a different rule entirely, one that the game has not yet taught you. You are instead applying the rule 1a. In order to touch a quantum object at all, you need to be looking at a photograph of it. This, on the face of it, seems like an arbitrary inconsistency. We are told that the moon is a quantum object, we are taught certain rules about how quantum objects work, but for some reason they don't apply to the quantum moon. No other quantum object in the game requires you to be holding a photograph of it to interact with it. The photograph is only useful as a tool to continue interacting with it while you look away from it. This inconsistency prompts two key questions in my mind. Why does the inconsistency exist? And given that it exists, how major a problem is it for the game as a whole? The answer to the first question I think is fairly straightforward. If the quantum moon behaved like any other quantum object, then landing on it would not be very challenging. Most players will encounter the moon, or one of the moon trackers, well before they learn about the photography rule. If there's no special requirement on you in order to land on the quantum moon, then you will probably land on it very early in the game, circumventing the need to explore as much of the solar system. Personally, once I had already learned Rule 3 about how vessels always land on the moon's south pole, I was sure this was a requirement for landing on the moon. You must land on its south pole. Even after I had learnt the photography rule, I continued to imagine this was a condition. This misconception was reinforced by the fact that the quantum moon tracker is on Ember Twin's south pole. I assumed that this was to allow the player to essentially hop from that south pole to the quantum moons, an easy way for you to know which way is south and which way is north from orbit. This turned out to be wrong, thank goodness, as attempting to land on its south pole was an incredible faff, especially with a photograph up too. You are meant to understand Rule 3 literally. When vessels land on the quantum moon, they do so on its south pole. So not, you need to land on the south pole to land at all, but rather, if you land on the moon at all, you will land on the south pole. This insistence on literal meaning makes the break with literal meaning with the photograph rule all the more irritating and confusing. It looks like I've already started answering that second key question too. How much of a problem is this for the game? Well, I think your mileage will vary. Clearly, given the game's mostly positive reception, it wasn't a major issue for the overwhelming majority of critics. In fact, a cursory inspection of the game's Metacritic reviews reveals no mention of this issue at all. But I can't get over it personally. It bugs me in a game that operates so elegantly, like a beautifully crafted Swiss watch, that it would have this glaring inconsistency in its rule set, as if one cog was slightly out of alignment. It would be a different story in a game that was less interested in scientific concepts, or one that didn't try to be a sort of pseudo-simulator of real physics. But in this game, such an inconsistency stands out against a background of consistency. So is there a better way that this quantum moon landing could have been handled? I would say yes. All that is required is the introduction of some new rule, like, to land on the quantum moon, you must not look at it directly. This would add more challenge to the process, which might not be a bad thing in and of itself. Or, if that wasn't to your liking, just make Rule 1a explicit somewhere. As it currently stands, the game tells you Rule 1 explicitly and expects you to infer Rule 1a when you fail to land on the quantum moon in the normal way. A third option, and I think my preference overall, would be to make the quantum moon behave like any other quantum object. That is to say, make landing on it possible when observing it directly. I don't think that this would be much of a problem, as the challenges posed by reaching the Moon's 6th location would still require significant exploration of the solar system, so it wouldn't dramatically decrease the player's incentive to interact with the world. There is one other, much less irksome example of this kind of inconsistency in the Outer Wilds. When you travel to the Dark Bramble, you have to avoid being eaten by the anglerfish. You can learn a rule to deal with them, which is that they are blind. Thus you can infer that they must be locating you with sound. Later, Feldspar, when you tell him about the rule, says that perhaps he shouldn't have rocketed around the place as fast as possible. The game seems to be suggesting that you should fire your rockets much less, keep them to slower, quieter speeds. While the essence of this thought ends up being true, the specifics of it do not. For some reason, the anglerfish are always able to locate you when you fire your rockets in your ship, whereas they are much worse at it when you use your jetpack. This is true even at comparable speeds between the jetpack and the ship, so presumably comparable levels of noise. The ship certainly doesn't sound louder to me, and yet the anglerfish are much more responsive to it. One would be forgiven for thinking the game just wants you to get out of your ship when you infiltrate the inner layers of the Dark Bramble, but, like with landing on the Quantum Moon, this does not follow from the rule as written. Now, with both of these points, I do feel somewhat like I am nitpicking, but I'm not going to pretend that it doesn't irk me either. My suspicion is that when you're making a game as systemic as the Outer Wilds, you eventually have to make some concessions to the demands of difficulty and structure. Regardless, I would urge Mobius Digital to endeavour to make the clues they give more consistent with the actual solutions to their puzzles in future games. This will help keep pedants like me from going insane, but it will also make the puzzles themselves more satisfying to solve. It's a better experience to complete a puzzle and feel as if you've grasped the workings of the entire mechanism, and that it was this understanding that allowed you to progress. Having to guess what the developer expects of you is annoying, especially when you have been told something specific that contradicts what's actually required.